Okay, so we're back for episode 2, season 3. And this time we're going back in time and we're coming back to now. So relax. Right, so we're going to talk about relationship practices, the culture of dating, and what the Christian worldview is for these same
Yeah, how we should be doing
issues.
this.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of rubbish being done now.
Ooh,
It's-
the
yeah,
streets
there's,
are
there's a lot of, yes, it's very
the
tough.
streets are not smiling at all.
A lot of unnecessary heartbreak and suffering that's needless. Suffering for doing evil that we can avoid. So,
So I say the streets are tough, and then you say all the plenty words you say.
yeah,
Wow, a match made in heaven.
yeah.
So-
but seriously, we need to talk about how people are doing this dating thing. There's a way that people are going about it now that is multiplying needless suffering.
Yeah, it's adding to the problem. It's definitely adding.
but
And
not-
I think it's the society at large.
Yes,
It's not.
it's cultural.
It's what one person is doing is affecting the other
Other
person,
person.
which is
So
in
it's
turn
becoming
affecting another
cultural,
person.
Yeah, so it's
becoming
become cultural. It has become cultural.
become
So
cultural.
we have developed a cultural dating system that is really painful for a lot of people, and it's probably getting worse. It has a lot of ramifications that we don't even realize.
Yeah.
It's affecting families in the long run, which in turn will affect children, which will in turn affect future generations. And once the family has problems, every other thing begins to become affected. Church is affected, politics is affected, work is affected, everything is affected.
I agree.
So we need to talk about
So it's
what's
affecting
right and what's
everything.
wrong. It's affecting
You actually
everything.
mentioned politics.
Yes, it does. It
From
does.
dating culture.
Yes, it affects how we do our politics.
Oh yeah, sweet. Just quickly wrap that. Connect it.
How it affects our politics.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the quality of our leaders is dependent on the kind of families that they come from, right? You would.
Okay.
It's very clear when you see a man. Most times politics is men that rise, but even women also. You see a person in politics that comes from a happy home, a steady home, and is not growing up in resentment and bitterness. Like not grow up in resentment and bitterness, and does not have a sense of they versus us. And if you grow up in a loving family, your worldview would not be oppressors versus oppressed. You would see things in terms of good and evil, what is right versus what is wrong. You tend to see things more like that. So when you become a politician or you are an advocate for policies and all that, you tend to not fall into the trap of looking at the whole world in terms of oppressors versus oppressed.
Yeah.
But I look at it in terms of what is right and what is wrong and all that. So a lot of the grievance politics and all that actually comes from these issues of assuming that everything is oppressors versus oppressed. Many political ideologies, racial ideologies
tied
and all
to
that. It's
their
just tied to just looking
families.
at the world
Yeah.
in terms of oppressors versus oppressed, resentment and all that. You know, there's a whole lot of what is popularly called feminism today that comes from the place of resentment, terrible men around you at home doing all kinds of evils, exacerbating that desire to want to, get retribution for all that. So men are evil. If you say love, if they love evil men around you growing up, you would also think of men are good. But if you see women that grew up with happy dads, good brothers, good uncles, and all that, they don't tend to think of the world like that. They tend to think of it as not all men are bad, and the men that are bad, we need good men, good strong men to put them down. And we can even go on into things like political ideologies about economics and all that, assuming that one entire group of people are the ones oppressing and all that. If you grew up in a family of, it affects everything. So yeah, we really need to talk about it.
Okay. I forgot what I wanted to say, but yes. So let's talk about this.
So what we should do first is go back into the history for Christians. By the way, this podcast is for Christians. But if you are not a Christian, you can learn, and I hope you become a Christian trait. But if you're not a Christian, if you don't share our core values, some things
Yes,
might
some things will
offend
say
you
that
or
you won't be
might not
happy
make
with.
sense to you, yeah. But yeah.
And that's okay.
So, but we want to go back in the history and talk about. You want to do that, right?
Yes, I want to just
Talk about how it used to be practiced.
how it used to be practiced, some
Yes.
things that happened.
So
yeah.
we'll not think that what we are doing today is how it has always been.
No, it hasn't always been this way, and sometimes it's good to understand where we are coming from as a society, the history of some of these things. Now, although some of the things I'm going to be saying is more Western, right? I didn't have time to do the research for the more contemporary history, but even from speaking with our grandparents and trying to infer, we can also infer what our own history of courtship and dating look like. But generally, right, another thing that changed between the last time we recorded our last episode and this is just how much we use ChatGPT for everything.
Yeah.
I'm saying that because part of this research I did with GPT, but I
Okay.
asked it for reference links so that I can validate the links. Anyway, so of course, going back to ancient time, marriage origins, courtship practices, again, it was mainly arranged by families.
Okay. So
It's always
what
been
was
that way,
dating like?
with little input from the individual involved. So in that case, dating didn't used to happen the way it happens now, because if it was arranged marriages, courtship was as a mutual romantic process was minimal or non-existent.
Which culture are you talking about? West African cultures, European cultures, or you say it's universal?
So it seemed to be universal because I'm seeing things around ancient Mesopotamia. Now this is really old, and even in ancient Greece, right? Marriages were often arranged to preserve family wealth and property, right? And it's some of the things that you see across even Europe, and I want to believe in Africa as well.
Yeah, at least like I have it. Yeah, we can't see.
We can almost see the
Yeah,
same thing,
yeah, we
right?
can.
Where
It was mostly arranged, actually.
it was mostly arranged, and not only was it arranged to fulfill a purpose. It was always around preserving family lines, preserving bloodlines, preserving wealth, preserving property, preserving things like that. Now, around the Renaissance to 19th century, courtship began to evolve, right? So during the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the concept of courtly love emerged, right? Characterized by chivalrous knights expressing admiration
So we're
and
talking
devotion.
Europe now. We're not talking about
We're
Africa
talking
yet.
Europe.
Okay.
We're not talking Africa yet, right? But as much as they had this, there was still parental influence. Marriages remained largely arranged by families. Courtship was just a formal process to assess suitability.
But could people break up in courtship after it has been arranged? If they
You can't
find-
ask me too deep questions. I'm not a historian.
Okay.
Yeah, so. But you could, so.
But I think so.
Yeah, if you can infer from some of the historical stories. So that's one way to understand what the cultural practice was, the kinds of books that were written about love and marriage in those times. You could infer. You could know that for some of those things it was very what's the word that I can use to say AWOL? It was very serious. If you broke up a courtship, it was a taboo. If you broke up a courtship, and I'm not even talking of marriage now, they took it as really serious, right? The culture wasn't marked with people going in and out of courtship so often, right?
Well, it could happen.
Well, it could happen, yes. There were times it happened. The other things that will probably mark it will be the stigma and the fact that people will be known for things like that. So going into the early 20th century, there was a shift to dating, right? So the early 1900s marked a significant shift from structured courtship to casual dating.
Okay.
This change was influenced by urbanization, increased social mobility, and the advent of new public spaces.
About this once, yes, because there was a lot of move from rural to urban areas. Families were not together as they used to be.
Yeah.
So that process of arranging marriages for people, the burden shifted from the parents
to the
person themselves.
to the individuals that are.
Yeah, I remember you even said something like that.
Yes, there's another place that I want to read that also says things like that, right? So dating became associated with consumer culture. Couples engaged in activities that required spending money, dining out, going to theaters, going to hall, attending entertainment events, right?
Because the way you're talking about it, that I really liked. Maybe you still talk about it, about how that. I love the insight about it, like how that actually finding a mate is a lot of work.
Oh yes,
and that work is the family's work. The
it had
burden
always
has become
been
too much on us.
Yes, it had always been the family's work.
I like
so
that way of thinking about
I will go there and I'll tell you where I got that thought from, right? And now going to mid to late 20th century, post-World War II, America, so it's talking about the West, going steady phenomenon where young couples would perform exclusive relationships as a precursor to marriage. And then the 1960s and 1970s brought the sexual revolution.
And everything is.
Where is there challenging traditional norms around sexuality, relationships, marriage? And now we are in the period of online dating. Of course, in all these years, there was no such thing as online dating, right? So given the technology boom, the internet, we can now have online dating, right? Dating platforms, mobile apps, and yeah. So let me read from somewhere else. So that was just first research. Now, this place, what the book I want to also read from is from The Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller, where there's a chapter where he spoke about the history of dating. So some of the things that I highlighted, which is also similar to some of the things I said in research, where he mentioned that in ancient times and into the 18th and 19th century, America again, marriages, of course, were ordinarily arranged, right? Now, it didn't mean that people didn't marry for romantic love, but it was just one of the reasons why. It wasn't the predominant reason why people
got married.
Yes. Now, as people went through time, by the late 19th century, the motive for marrying for love became more culturally dominant. And a system of calling, sometimes called courtship, came into being. Right? So that's where it started. But even when it started by the guy going to the woman's house. So you can also see that thing that was consistent. When it comes to entering relationships, the family had always been involved. And you see this across different cultures, right?
It's universal, actually.
It's almost universal. By the time we segue and we want to even dig deep into African culture, let's even talk about culture, which we're more familiar with, you'd also see that the marriage was always a family affair. It was always two families coming together, so the families were always involved. It wasn't a case of two random people just meeting themselves on the road, falling in love. Oh, yes, they might see a flower that they like and they're interested, but
the family gets involved.
And guess what? Because of our communal living, you most times knew who the person was.
Yeah.
They were not strangers, right? And the family gets involved. In fact, the way you start it is by getting the family involved. That's when you start courtship.
That's when you say you start the courtship.
That's when you say you start the courtship, right? So again, continuing late 19th century, right? There, when a man goes to meet a woman, he always saw her in the context of her family, and her family saw him as well, right? Now, somewhere after the turn of the century, that's when modern dating developed, right? And then the last social change, which is more recent, not long after the turn of the 21st century, is the hookup culture, which emerged, right?
That's the absolute word.
And of course, the advent of hookup culture has meant that we have one of the first societies with no clear culturally supported pathways for single adults to meet and marry.
Right.
So that's where we got to where we are. And the reason why I don't mind quoting some of the history on the Western cultures down to our own is because we are largely influenced by Western culture, right? Through movies, through globalization and things like that, we are influenced with it and we are where we are. So one of the insights I got by doing this research was that there's the concept of falling in love. And I'm not going to say falling in love is a recent thing, because even if you see the Bible, there are stories of Jacob and Leah, there are stories of King Solomon, there's the love letters and things like that. So there's always been falling in love. Now, at what point do you fall in love? Or is it that you love somebody, then you go and marry, or you marry somebody and all of a sudden she becomes the dear and the fun and
but
all of that?
It was never the constant, it's just of time when it starts and all that.
Yes. But one of the things we've always seen, because marriage was always practically seen, marriage is seen as the avenue in which you start a family, you bring children into this world. And for societies that are very communal, it had to involve the input of everybody in the community, starting from your own family. I think it was also a protection mechanism, right? So that you don't just bring somebody.
Oh, it was because marriage itself is like the fundamental structure of community and society, and so that's why human beings have intuitive land. I think it's the work of God. Have always strongly regulated marriage.
Yes.
Because if marriage is not regulated, the whole society will be undermined. So marriage is not just your business.
Now, does that sound familiar?
Business. Yes, it does. It does.
So it's
our business.
We're going through a lot.
Yeah, we are.
Second thing that came out strong, when I was reading it, I just realized that the pressure on single people, the pressure that single people are going through today is nowhere, like, it's not a thing. It's not something that has always been.
It's not supposed to be.
It's not supposed to be. There's also the pressure of unmet expectation, right? And we're not going to lie about that, because the moment people are raised in a society where they expect you to see your Prince Charming, fall in love with your Prince Charming, and ride into your happily ever after. That's also going to be a pressure that you take when you're going into courtship. Thank you. And Tim Keller also talks about that at some point in his book. It's part of the pressures that contribute to it, as against the ancient times. I don't even want to say ancient times because this thing was even...
It's recent. It's like still, 150 years ago, it was still like, yeah.
Yeah. Things like that. The family knows that when you come of age, you're going to get married. You will see that plus the father, plus the mother, they are ready. They are all the ones thinking about the headache. So the pressure, there was pressure for people, but you weren't under so much pressure to go and find a perfect...
Do you know this thing you are saying, it really touched me.
Yeah.
Because I began to see it from a more... I began to see it made me, should I say, for lack of a better word, more compassionate towards people, more forgiving. Let me not say more forgiving, in that a lot of people are messing up in how they're going about dating. And rightly, many of them because of their own sins and their own issues. But to be honest, a large part of it is how society has also failed people.
Yes.
How families have failed people, because people actually shouldn't be doing this work they are doing.
All by themselves.
Their parents, their siblings, their uncles should be doing this work. It should be it's like human beings, individuals, are now doing the work of a whole society by themselves.
Yes. And here's the...
So they will make mistakes. They will,
no, you will make mistakes. And again, there's the part of, amongst many other things, part of security, right? There's a lot of sad stories that we hear about people entering relationships and getting married only to realize that
different person. Because
there was
scrutinizing
no
of a person should not be your work alone.
No, it shouldn't.
It should be society's work.
It shouldn't. It should not be your own. Let me tell you another way we failed.
Right.
It's a larger context. Another way we failed is we have a society where it's become culturally acceptable for people who are all sorts of people to thrive in the same society. So
yes, urbanization.
Then it was, if you had bad character,
you stick out.
You stick out. If you came from a bad family, or a family that was known to kill people, or a family that was known to abuse people.
In your family,
do you understand? People knew those type of things, right? It's again all those security mechanisms. Like, it's a huge thing for you as a human being to rely on only your two eyes.
Only your two eyes and your dating and DM.
To be able to, figure out some of these things.
Yes, like it's a lot.
It is a lot.
That's why okay, that makes sense actually. That makes a lot of sense.
But here's the other part. I don't want people thinking that, so are you now saying that only my family should arrange for me? Because again, a lot of things.
It was never either or.
But it's not just the family alone. Again, like that's why I keep pulling it back to the society, right? Because now there are many people that we know. Personally, if you tell their family to arrange somebody for them, the family is going to arrange trouble, because we also have cultures that have become really materialistic, and all they will care about is now. The
family can even arrange rubbish for you.
That's another problem, because till today, families still arrange people. And part of the things that we'll talk about around the practices, how families are now getting involved in things like this. And that's first. Second part, I'm not in any way even saying that what I read historically is Christian, right? Although I believe there's a Christian way to do things like that. But I just want to be clear that I'm not now saying that it means that as a society, your family must always arrange for you. We're just trying to pull out the problem, how we got to where we are, right? And where we currently are now, what the streets look like, which really look like shaggy. Right, to come to think about it, even how we met, and I'm just thinking of my kids. Are you going to say that it's just going to be left to them?
To them, like
to just come back and say
from school and say, Daddy,
this is the person. Do you understand? So how do you protect? How do you know that the guy you are meeting is not just one random?
To be sure,
it's not just one thing like that. So yes, so we are where we are now. What I want us to do next is now look at some of these practices. We've tried to outline some things, talk a bit about what we think the current practice looks like, and for each of those things, how the Christians should do it, how they should handle some of these things. So let's first start with what we've really spoken about, dating, which is meeting people.
And considering
them, getting to know people. Currently, what does that look like? What do you think it looks like from everything you've heard?
current, urban, even rural, 21st century contemporary, what it looks like is I just meet someone somewhere, either when we're in the same space, maybe from school or someone, and I am attracted to the person based on some external things that manifest, and then I get to talking to the person, I start thinking of the person and all that, and then there's no barrier between my talking to get to know the person and deep emotional involvement. So for most people it overlaps.
As you're talking, you're already getting emotionally involved.
Getting very emotionally involved.
And nothing formal might have even started.
And even nothing formal might have started. And then from that emotional distance, so there are two pathways from that. While talking and getting emotionally involved, or maybe one of them or both of them are getting emotionally involved, or expectations are being stirred up in both of them. What can either happen is that it can now lead, it's probably now leading to a courtship for some people.
Yeah.
But for some others, it might now lead to an ending of that talking and
then you have to start the cycle all over again.
For those that go on to courtship, depending on the different situation, the different kind of things that can happen to courtships, some proceed into marriage, happy marriages, some proceed into bad marriages, some end some end at the level of the courtships because of different issues and everything.
So the funny thing is that what we're now saying is before a person gets married, it's possible they have dated 10 people.
10. Oh, sweetie.
Sorry.
In this country,
hey, I'm counting now.
Remember when?
I'm counting from 18 years old. Let's say you are 18 and you get married 28. That's 10 years.
My dear, that 10 you just
one
called.
year, one year per person.
That's 10 you just called now. It shows that you're really a Christian. You're
Wow.
a Christian child. Let me tell you, you remember this story now, when we got married. After we got married, a few years after getting married, I was talking to someone to work and counseling and all that, and the person was talking about how, someone was talking about how she had probably like 30, is it 15 or 25 past sexual partners and everything. Now, a culture where people have had up to 20, 15 in their 20s, sexual partners. 20s. Talk about dating and talking stage. Some people have done 100.
I see what you mean. So even those are the ones that got to sex. So we're talking of
exactly talking stage. Like I started DMing you, and the next thing we started smiling.
And there are those that do like 3 at once.
And there are those that do like 3 at once. So it's a very terrible place now. It's bloodshed, man.
Yeah, the streets are bloody.
The streets are bloody.